Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Cradle's first interview broadcast. We are here to rock the cradle. You've waited a long time for this, and we're finally here in large part because of the love that Patreons have given us over this last month in particular. If you're not a Patreon, please consider joining today so we can bring you more high caliber interviews of this kind throughout the many months of crisis, no doubt, that lie ahead in West Asia. Especially now as the beat of war drums becomes deafening. We'd like to do this every day if possible, but we absolutely 100% undeniably need your contributions to make it happen. And while you're here, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and the like button. Follow us on X, Instagram, TikTok, Rumble, Spotify, and Telegram, where we bring you up to the minute updates on this volatile region every day and all day long. So let's move right along and introduce our very first guest on Rock the Cradle. He is somebody whose work I've been following very carefully and avidly for well over a decade. He's one of only a handful of analysts and regional experts that I place stock in, and who has consistently read the tea leaves correctly. And this is hard because little is predictable in West Asia, especially today. So let's welcome Alastair Crooke, founder of the wonderful Conflicts Forum, a former British and EU diplomat, a man who has sat in many a room that we mere mortals will never get to experience in our lifetimes. Alastair, it's lovely to have you here. How are you doing lately?
Well, I'm fine, but I think you're better off not being in those rooms because they inevitably are rather depressing, actually. It's better to stay at your 200-meter gaze and take the long view. So that's fine.
I often wonder, sitting in those rooms, whether or not it just, it's a repetition of a certain kind of thinking that surely must impact your psyche, eventually making you think that certain things that you thought were possible are really not possible, and making you basically be prepared to trudge down a long, dark path. Especially for someone like you who likes to poke holes in the narratives and question authority.
It's certainly true. I mean, this was my experience when I worked for Javier Solana, the EU High Representative in Brussels. And it's unbelievable. It's the sort of groupthink, a certain culture that exists there. They are very precious. All of it's so precious and sort of a false courtesy about the discussions. But you're right. And everyone goes from one committee to the next committee, to the NATO committee, and then back to the EU committee and the Commission committee, and then to the cocktail party where they meet all the same people again in the evening. It is, it does exert a really huge control over people's thinking. And also, it's unwelcome to be the contrarian in these meetings because they're all trying to find, the word is always has to be consensus and bringing everyone together. So, if you say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense, it's not welcome because that means undoing a whole lot of pre-meeting meetings and agreeing what might be the policy. And you pull a thread and then everyone gets quite angry and looks and says, well, goodness me, you're being very troublesome.
But I have to say, Alastair, I congratulate you on being able to depart that arena and maintain your not just integrity, but I think credibility, because that often doesn't happen to people who leave it, because I would say your voice is even more prominent on the global, discourse stage than perhaps it was when you were in those rooms. So we appreciate the fact that you took that bold step and you're here to talk to us and give us those insights. Look, how are you with all the things going on? Are you excited? Are you overwhelmed? Excited is how some of us regional specialists tend to be when things kick off, right? Because then there's a lot to do.
Well, I do. You mentioned it just before we started the recording, but I mean, I've always, someone once said to me, what's changed for you? And I said, well, I stopped looking at my feet and I started looking up. And what you see? You see the hawks sitting there
Mm.
stationary at 300 meters looking down. And they see an old tree trunk, and there's a little mouse crawling up the tree trunk. And the hawks look, and they can also see the cat in the grass next to it. And they can see what's going to happen. Now, does that mean the hawks are pro mouse or pro cat? No, it just means you can see what's about to take place. It is what it is. And the hawk sits there and watches the tragedy for the mouse unfold.
This is such an important thing that you said. And again, like we were discussing before we started, um, people get so dragged into the weeds here. So they panic. And you really have to take that 200-foot view. You really have to be able to see all the elements on the ground. And I think from that perspective, people like you and myself who have been looking at the multipolar world developing ever faster as the years go on, can see that there's for every action by the Americans and their allies, there is a reaction. And just because the reaction isn't reported in the English language press doesn't mean it's not happening and pressuring the main actors on the stage today. So this viewpoint is very important. Let's bring it to play right now, Alastair. It could be that we are standing on the precipice of a final war between Iran and the US. It could also be a lot of talk. Will there be war? Why or why not?
Okay. We do need to unpack a little bit to understand why there may or may not be that war. I think if you go back to the June regime change effort with the sneak attack by Israel on Iran, this was a sneak attack that took place that ended with the decapitation of much of the military leadership and the assassination of many researchers involved in the nuclear program. And it was intended to topple Iran. There was absolutely no doubt about it. They had persuaded Trump that Iran was a house of cards and that one little push and the house of cards would fall over and it would be similar to Syria. I think the Syria aspect, and whether they have it correctly understood or not correctly understood, nonetheless is playing a huge role in how they see the region. Indeed, how they see Venezuela and other parts of the world too. You take out the leadership, you have a decapitation, and then you just move on from that. And that was intended in June. And it contained a surprise. It contained a surprise for the Iranians. It shocked them and shook them. The infiltration of these units, these covert units that had been set up for some time with, if you like, suitcases with drones in them, with strike anti-tank weapons in their backpacks. They had come in and they started targeting the short-range air defenses of Iran. And that shocked them, and the Iranians didn't know where this threat was coming from because it was coming from the ground or around them. And it took some time to understand it and to deal with it. So initially, they had to pull back their mobile radars, put them into the tunnels, and if you like, that was the moment that Israel had its short window of attack on Iran. By the way, not flying it because they didn't believe that was possible, but by standoff, cruise missiles and drones fired either from Azerbaijan or just outside Iran's airspace in Syria. And then eventually there was a pause, and the Iranians had to clear these the threat from, if you like, these covert groups. And they did it then, incidentally and interestingly, by cutting off the internet. They cut off the internet because they were using the Iranian mobile telephone system to feed in the data and the targeting for their drone strikes onto these short range. Anyway, that was an episode, and the Iranians overcame it, and they got rid of all of those covert. They had to clear them, find them, clear them first before they could really activate their main defensive air defense systems. There was also a cyber attack, but that was quickly dealt with. But the main threat and the main surprise, and why I'm emphasizing the surprise, was that this was the surprise in June. Move forward to where we are now, and actually the surprise has reversed, because the whole of this second wave, this wave that we're just in the middle of, that started on the 28th of December, of course, Mar-a-Lago talks were in progress with Netanyahu, and the Israelis were going to, lure him in a different way by saying, look, we're not coming to say that they're, a week away from a nuclear bomb, or 2 weeks or 10 weeks. What we're saying is the danger is their missile system. They are not just reconcerting it. They're not just rebuilding it. They're rethinking it from scratch. And it is very dangerous, because this is going to mean that even were we to detect a move by Iran towards a weapon, we would not be able to penetrate the defensive umbrella any longer. So there's a short window, Trump. You have to take advantage of this window, and you have to go now and destroy the air defense, the ballistic missile system of Iran. And it seems, and when I say seems, I'll explain why it seems that Israel got a green light from Trump. Why do I say it seems is one of the things that I noticed, because we look through the Hebrew press regularly. My wife does that consistently. And what was interesting is, it's not all one voice in the Hebrew world, as opposed to the, English language. But it was wall to wall across the spectrum. Yes, Trump gave the green light, and gave the green light for an attack on Hezbollah. And normally you would expect in Hebrew, they'd say, yes, he gave the green light, but did he really mean it? Or is this, just talk? Or is this just Trump? That wasn't there. It seemed to be pretty clear that their interpretation, rightly or wrongly, was a green light was given. And so what did we see? The first of the precursors to regime change duly fell into line, an attack on the Rial through Dubai. It dropped on the 28th of December, on the same day Mar-a-Lago talks were going on. It dropped some 30%. For what reason? What was the peg that caused such a drop in the Rial? Well, there wasn't one, except people were shorting the Rial in order to buy it back at a later stage. So it was a concerted attack on the currency. We've seen this many times before. You'll recall with Russia, just at the crucial moment, there's the hedge funds in Wall Street concert and do a short selling raid on the ruble. This time it was on the Rial, and it's true. The Bazaris were aghast, because a 30% drop meant that their businesses were no longer viable. So they started protesting, but they were protesting about that, the drop in the currency, and simply the mismanagement of the economy by this government, and the fact that they didn't have any means to do anything about it. Actually, it would have been easy to do something about it because the Chinese had already promised financial support to Iran. They'd said, if it's requested, we will give financial support. With the Chinese resources, they would be able to go into Dubai without spending very much, buy the rial very cheaply, and raise its price. They would actually make a profit on this exercise if they did it properly. So, I mean, it wasn't a very difficult ask of the Chinese. So we had that. The Bazaris have been thought or been presented in the Western press as having been, by Bazaris, of course, I mean the merchant class, were sort of antagonistic against, the system, against the Iranian Republic. That wasn't true. And they then joined in their own demonstrations and their own protests against the rioters, the armed, violent rioters. So they were entirely with the state and with the supreme leader, although they did believe, and with some reason, that, the economy has not been well managed and that therefore they have suffered this if you like, crash in the currency. So that was the first peg. Then the second peg was the start of these demonstrations by these rioters. These are groups that were infiltrated, again, like in June, were infiltrated mostly, first of all, primarily through the border with Iraq. These are Kurds that had come in, Kurds that had been trained by the United States. And they came in and the corridors were open because the Turkish government was providing intelligence to Iran about the Kurdish groups coming in, mostly in Karamanshah province. And they were arrested or killed, many of them. It was about 200 or more than 200, clearly trained, armed, and with instructions about what to do. Then there was the MEK, who are trained in Albania. 3,000 men are under training by America in Albania for this assault on Iran, which they hoped would collapse the regime. As always, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, the Western narrative, these states are a house of cards, one little puff, and the whole house will collapse. And that's what they were expecting at this time. I just want to say a word about the nature of it, because one surprise in this was the extreme violence of this small group of rioters. So they would go to a place where a crowd was collecting, a crowded place. They would be told to go there. They would be instructed by the NGOs and others who were controlling the operation. They would go there, and then they would pick on someone, a bystander, not someone involved or anything else, and they'd start beating them. And they beat them really severely. And around them, and part of this team, were women who would film it all. And their role was to shout, "Go on, kill him, burn him, burn him." And of course, this attracted more crowds as people were watching this poor man being beaten and attacked, and said, "Kill him, he's dangerous, he's a whatever he said he was." And then, of course, the security forces would come, and somewhere in the background, a shot would be fired at the security forces. If you've been under fire at any times, it's only in the films you know exactly where the shot has come from. In real life, you just hear the noise and you know that a shot has been taken near to you. So the security force then shoot back at whom they assume to be the instigators, but they hit ordinary people. And then they have a riot. And so this is how they've done that. And then additionally, very violently attacking buses. A whole group of them would be 20, 30 would suddenly come out and smash a bus. They would go into a mosque. They would go to libraries. They would go all to government, to banks and they would set fire to banks to create an atmosphere that the point of this was to show that the establishment was losing control, and that therefore, if there was an intervention by America or Israel, that would have something to feed on. That's why Trump says in his statement to them, take control over the establishment buildings and things like those. He's acting like, a guide sitting in Washington trying to inspire his people on the ground. Then the whole thing changed overnight and it became quite different. And the whole strategic calculus shifts, because not only did Iran cut off the mobile international telephone system and the internet, which they'd done previously, but they cut off Starlink. And, the Americans and Israelis are shocked because they've said, this has never happened. It can't be done. You can't shut down Starlink. Well, it's been shut down. It has been a complete loss of interoperability, and they cannot use it. And the West has put in something like 40,000 Starlink connections, and now the users of those are being arrested and are being taken away, and it's collapsed. So the surprise is on the Iranian side this time, not on the Israeli side, as it was on the 12th of June. The surprise has shifted 180 degrees and taken the Americans, because without that Starlink, they can't manage, they can't run the riot against the establishment.
We will have run a video of a cache of Starlink devices being discovered in Iran that's come in from an unnamed Arab country while you're speaking about this. But if we could just take a moment and Karim, run the video of the protest. Now, this is a video, it's a reel that Cradle put together but a week ago. So in the interim, things got a lot hotter. You can see, you will see in this video burning of property, burning of vehicles, attacking of security forces who were unarmed in these videos. Otherwise, they would have shot back. This was a criticism of the security forces in Iran during the Mahsa Amini protests in 2022. They said, at least give us weapons to be able to defend ourselves. But in this case, too, you can see that they're unarmed. Again, this is a week ago. It got a lot hotter before Iran cut off the internet and stopped them and brought down Starlink, which we're also being told is an area in which they got Russian help, because Starlink is very, very actively used over the Ukraine military theater, and the Russians have learned how to block it. And so that was brought to the Iranians very swiftly. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what is being discussed. Back to
what I hear from, I can't give you a categoric answer, but what I hear from Iran was that it's actually a Chinese technology, but the big EW towers that you've seen, these huge things, which are from, being used in the Ukraine context, came from Russia. So the big EW electronic warfare towers and equipment, I think, came from Russia, but maybe but who knows? It doesn't really matter. It worked. And it changes so much, because this has been the key regime change tool of the West. They relied on it, and they thought it was impossible for it to be broken and stopped. And that's what's happened. And that's why I think, we see, first of all, after the 9th, these riots, the very violent riots, and as I said to you, the aim of it was to be as violent as possible, to bring in, to give pretext for Trump and others and the Europeans to say, we must come in and stop this. So they were trained and orchestrated to do these things. It's quite clearly they are organized. in their approach, and they do these exercises. And so the cutting off of the Starlink really shifts the whole calculus for America and for Iran, because it's one thing to, if you like, intervene in one way or another where a country is crumbling and coming apart, and these things are coming. It's quite a difference to tackle a country that's on the rebound. And Iran is now, acting from a position of strength, not weakness, as it was supposed to. I would.
No, I was just going to say, one of the things as you were talking about the element of surprise. Today, I kind of envision that Netanyahu-Trump meeting in Mar-a-Lago. Netanyahu is obviously wanting to discuss Iran. He needs to distract from his legal problems internally. He has to have conflict buzzing, otherwise he can't stay in his position as prime minister. And I can imagine Trump saying, I'll do it, but you've got to give me the grounds, right? But this time, Israel doesn't have the element of surprise that it had in June. And then it has June actually created the conditions for millions more Iranians who weren't particularly in support of their government to then support their government, because they started to see what was behind the curtain, who was playing what game, right? And what you were just talking about, you're saying things that people don't say in English often, which is protesters or rioters shooting into protests. In Syria, which you and I covered very closely from the start, 2011, we had an indication that this kind of thing was happening. And then miraculously in 2012, we got that declassified DIA document from 1982 that told us that the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria and Hama were dressing up in security force clothing and shooting at protesters in order for people to blame government forces and justify, a stronger reaction with weapons and other kinds of tools. And then we saw that in Maidan 2 years later in 2014. Gunmen shooting at both sides, and we have that famous leaked audio between, was it the EU foreign minister at the time and one of the European foreign ministers, saying our investigators have found the same bullets from the same weapons being shot at people on both sides. It's like getting protesters to think that security forces are shooting at them, and getting security forces to think protesters are shooting at them. So today I saw a very interesting tape. It just sort of arrived on cue. Coco, can we roll that tape of Iran's foreign minister, Araghchi?
We have audio recordings of messages sent from outside the country to these terrorist elements, telling them, open fire while you are among the protesters. If you can shoot the police, do so. If you cannot, then shoot ordinary people. And if that is not possible, then shoot the girl or the young man directly in front of you. We possess extensive evidence and documents indicating the involvement of both the United States and Israel in this terrorist act. Israeli media outlets are full of reports claiming they are busy planning operations inside Iran.
To you and I, this is not surprising. Of course, many people will say, "Oh, it's the Iranian foreign minister. Of course, he's going to do that." It's the same old the global South tyrants blaming it on others, right? But in this case, we have the Israelis saying openly, the Americans saying openly that we're right there beside you. We're going to get arms and we're going to get more, help into you. Anyone who sells anything to Iran anymore will get a 25% tariff on all their products to the United States. I mean, they're really trying to cook this. But today there were mass crowds. I mean, not just what we've seen in the last few days that are pro-government crowds, millions of people, but there are mass crowds gathered for funeral processions across Iran. They are chanting pro-government slogans but these are funerals not just for martyred police forces, but for civilians killed in there. So this gives weight to what Iran's Foreign Minister Araghchi has just been saying. What do you think?
Oh, look, this is a classic playbook of creating a disturbance, on the ground, having a big disturbance, getting a crowd, and then, even in Palestine, when I was there 20 years ago, whenever there was a demonstration or stone throwing or whatever it was taking place, and there was a clash between Israel and the Palestinians, instead of going to the front to see what's going on, I would always go to the back. And I'd look up in the back and see, and most often than not, more often than not, you'd see there the lone gunman ready to do the job, firing into the crowd, just as you said with Maidan. Look, unfortunately, it's not new. It's a standard Western approach. But what was obvious in this one was, they really wanted to get the violence up quickly and really sharply. So there was a lot of, it was excessive violence. It wasn't a sort of gradual sort of movement towards a wider demonstration. It was to show the violence and to give the pretext for an American or Israeli intervention, which is different because normally these things take more time to get to a point where the government. And I was going to say to you, and you're saying one thing, but I would just like to sort of mention, you probably know him, Ehud Yari, who is the veteran security correspondent in Israel in the Hebrew Mariv Party. And he was saying a couple of days ago, after the 9th, after the peak, he said, look, we do not see clear cracks in the regime mechanisms, in the government, nor in the armies, the regular and the Revolutionary Guards. And we do not see dysfunction in the Basij. We see signs of hesitation here and there, nothing more than that. And so that's him, not me saying that, but that's what Yari is. He's always been a professional intelligence officer and not a propagandist. So he just says it, and he says, therefore it must be said honestly. It will be weeks before we see where this is going. That's what he's saying to the Israeli public that listens to him. It wasn't on a Western, because this was a Hebrew one in Mariv,
where you always hear much more interesting discussions. But, this is why, the fact that it's unusual that they're throwing everything in the kitchen sink at this so quickly. There's usually an escalation to allow for the public to come behind something before you take it to the next step. They're literally going all out. And it's what makes me think that Trump told Netanyahu, look, I'll do it, but you have to give me something, right, to make it a compelling case, because as we know, the MAGA base is splitting on this, is split on Israel, and will split on Iran if he goes to war. And then, what was it yesterday? Trump tries to add into the sense of, crisis by saying, Iranian patriots keep protesting, take over your institutions, which is insane because, that's the thing. He thinks Iran's a banana republic. The man just doesn't know enough about Iran. This is one of the few countries in this world in which, not in the world, in West Asia, in which if one institution collapses, there are many others to step in. It's not that simple. There are at least 3 centers of power, and there is a balance, and some rise with their fortunes sometimes, and then they, others rise at different times. And it's not as he expects, people storming a TV station and saying we've taken over the country. He's mad to think that, but that's okay. It benefits us in some ways that he knows so little. I
wrote a piece, but I just think it's worthwhile saying that what you said broadly about how to manage it, was uppermost on Trump's mind. Why does he want this in Iran? And I think it's because he's trying to manage the split in MAGA. As you know, the MAGA is very split, saying, we're America first, we're not Israeli first. Right. But also, there is huge pressure coming from the big Jewish donors on the MAGA to say, no, you can't take a position that it's all right to criticize Israel, and that's not anti-Semitism. They're saying, if you criticize Israel, that's anti-Semitism, and anti-Semitism isn't allowed in the Republican Party. So there is an attempt to put the wedge in to the MAGA, and it's coming from the old guard, the old Republican guard. And the attempt is to weaken them ahead of the midterms. The old Republican country club guard never liked Trump. They were part of the formulation to try and prevent him getting into office. He's seen as this wild card. So they managed to crush the Tea Party in 2010, and now they want to weaken it. So the apparatus comes and takes control of the MAGA movement because it's a powerful movement for getting out the vote, and because they have chapters and they're organized in many universities. So they want to take control of it. And I think Trump, in many ways, was trying to sort of manage this by giving a very strong demonstration of being pro-Israel, and at the same time, privately but let it be known in the Western press that there'd been tough discussions and hard talking about Gaza and about what's happening in Syria and in Lebanon, so that he was trying to find a compromise that Vance could live with, whereby Vance, who said, no, it's all right to criticize. It's quite acceptable to criticize Israel, and that's not anti-Semitism. And the Jewish establishment have come down very hard on this. So I think one of the reasons he quite wanted this was to demonstrate support for Israel. And Israel, no doubt, had told him, look, we've got this crack. There's going to be a big demonstration. The regime is going to shake. It's all going to collapse. And you don't have to worry. It'll be like Venezuela. You can come in at the last moment and negotiate the removal of the top leadership and send them off to Moscow or whatever, and you can have another great victory. And I think, he doesn't know Israel. I mean, although he's so pro-Israel, I don't think he knows Israel so well. He doesn't understand how it's changed in the last 10 years. It's changed utterly. And so I think he thought, and what's motivating it is because I think he's getting desperate on the economic front. Economically, I mean, whether it's the tariffs or the attempt to reduce the debt or the affordability crisis in the United States, the polls are all showing disaster coming in the midterms as things stand. So I think, part of Venezuela, part of this was because he wanted to show, I'm the strong man. I make America great again. Maybe I can't do it at the moment on the economic front, but listen, look what we've done in Venezuela. We're going to take Greenland. We've just, got rid of this war criminal, as he calls him, Khomeini from Iran. So I think there was a reason that Trump said yes. And as you pointed out, there was a very good reasons why Netanyahu would want it, because his crisis is getting much worse. And there are elections coming up this year, not only the old ones about corruption, that Israelis say, if it goes to trial, if it goes and is completed, he will probably be convicted. That's their legal view. Now it's Gattagate. And there are really harsh things being said about Gattagate. I mean, from serious commentators, Boogie Alon, from Bennett, Naftali Bennett, the sort of prime minister in waiting, saying, is this treachery that we're experiencing? I mean, these are harsh words and creating a huge, political volatility within Israel. So, what's the way when the walls are closing in on you and you want to get out? Go up, go up. Don't retreat. Go ahead.
No, that's the thing. These guys have to stay kinetic, otherwise, Epstein files or court jail for Netanyahu. But we know pretty much that the U.S. and the Israelis, at least the Israeli firsters in the U.S., want this war. They also see this as a very unique window of opportunity before it comes crashing down on their heads, before the dollar maybe loses its global dominance. Before you don't have a Trump in the White House any longer, right? And saner minds come into play. But let's talk about Iran's side on this, all right? Because one new surprising element is the Iranian national security bodies, the new one that was announced late last year, just approved the use of preemptive strikes. Will Iran use this power? Because it's tended to use any kind of military force as a way to de-escalate. Preemptive strike is escalatory. This would be quite remarkable. It would come as a surprise. I mean, it's on the table, but the war of words takes place well before hot wars do, and this could just be words. Do you think they'll use it? And moreover, if the U.S. attacks Iran directly, will Tehran's first response be to rain missiles on Israel, which, let's be honest, is, the U.S.'s most valuable forward operating military base in West Asia? There's no bigger target for one to hit if you want to take out American power in the region. Yeah. Can Iran do shock and awe, or is it still trapped in its yesteryear thinking of striking mainly to de-escalate?
This is why I mentioned and went into a bit of length about the June attack, where Iran was taken by surprise, was in a state of shock for a day or two, and then they came back from it and came back remarkably fast. And then there was a huge outpouring of support for the government, as you mentioned. Now, I think what that means, or what that says in a way, is that a preemptive attack is possible. I don't rule it out. I don't see the signs of it happening. The Iranians still maintain that sort of delicate balance of trying to keep deterrence and diplomacy, that thin line of keeping the two. They haven't done it very well, I have to say. They've tended to sort of, and it was Abdullahian, the former foreign minister who was killed in that helicopter, who spoke out very clearly before his death and said, Iran has gone too far towards diplomacy, and we need to get a better balance between deterrence and diplomacy. It's not always easy to do that. You go too far in deterrence and you get attacked because people get frightened. Go too far in diplomacy, you're seen as weak and you'll be attacked. So you have to balance this fine line. And he spoke about that. But this last government has not been very good at finding, I think, that sort of that balance that would refuse it. I do think what I'm really saying is they're also probably calculating in Iran now that that the regime change engine, the motor to it, this this group, the rioters and others, has been this, and there's been no protests since they peaked on Thursday, but over this weekend, a few gatherings, but nothing of any real significance. The government is intact. I mean, there haven't been defections from the Basij, as Ehud Yahya said, or from the IRGC, or political defections. So it's there and strong. So what can Trump or Israel do now? And I think that is why we're seeing a sort of suddenly, they were shocked. And I think Trump has been having a talk with Elon Musk. How can you switch this on? You told us it could never be switched off. But it's gone. So, my guess is, and this is where I think we're going to, it's not going to work, is that, Trump will take the Venezuela model, not in exactly the same way, but you recall in the attack on the nuclear sites and after the June the 13th sneak attack by Israel, that there was this attack by America on the 4 nuclear sites. I think it's almost certain that was agreed through some intermediary, perhaps through the Swiss or something like this. Because if you look at the videos and the evidence, there was no sign of any Iranian air defense systems firing or being in operation. I mean, they had a clear sky, and it was mostly Tomahawks. It came in. They did what they did. Whether it was effective or not is another issue, but they did what they did. And then there was a token strike, wasn't so token, on Al-Udeid base, but which took out the radar and the communication center for the whole of CENTCOM. No injuries, no collateral damage. They just took out that main huge, dome, which was the main radar over the horizon radar and the communication structures of Udeid. And so both sides said, okay, we both win. Now, of course, the West has a bit louder megaphone, so it will always present it as they winning rather than anyone else. But I think that's, I from what I believe and hear, I do not think that that's possible now. I don't think Iran is in the mood after what happened. If you like, the deceit that was present, pretending they were in negotiations with America while America was, and Trump was at that time conspiring with Israel for the surprise attack on it. Now, so I think that isn't possible to say, okay, go in, I'm going to go in, empty the IRGC headquarters, I'm going to bomb that. You can bomb an Israeli sort of radar base somewhere, and we'll say, that's it. I do remember during the attack on the nuclear sites, Trump was saying to his people, because the one thing, it's quite easy to know what he's actually saying because he telephones people incessantly in middle of the night. And he says the same thing to all of them. And you're not supposed to answer him, or sort of, he says, isn't that great? I mean, we're winning. We're going to win this one, aren't we? And you're supposed to nod and say, yes, Mr. Trump. I mean, you don't say, look, what you're doing entails huge risk. You just. And so he was saying everything. And he said, it's got to be clean. It's got to be quick. It's got to be clean. And it's got to be, I don't want casualties. I just want a clean, quick headline. Imagine the headlines tomorrow. I mean, it's great. It's going to sweep the world. This is what he was saying to people. And I imagine he's still saying something similar on the telephone to the people he calls and say, look, I mean, Iran, I thought Iran was going to be quick, clean. We just go in and we remove the supreme leader, and then who would take over? That there would be a government that wanted to work with us and, who hated this, where are all these reformists then that are going to take over from us? And so I think all I'm saying is it presents both Israel and America a dilemma, what to do next.
I agree with you. I think it's also emblematic of every single one of the U.S. military's adventurism in decades now. A few days or weeks of headlines, and then what now? what comes after. And of course, there's never a plan. But, interestingly, with Trump hitting Nigeria and kidnapping Maduro in Venezuela, he's created the sort of a perfect situation in which, Iran can justify, because Iran tends to cleave to international law. It's always thought that protects it, when in fact its adversaries don't at all. They completely, just trample all over it. But in this case, complete violations. I mean, people are saying in Western media headlines, there's no more rule of law, right? So, and then with the Americans and Israelis openly admitting, really in a remarkable way for the first time, Alastair, that they are right there on the ground, right, with the rioters. A preemptive strike becomes as justified as anything. And who's going to say no against it? Because immediately someone will say, well, what about Maduro? What about Nigeria? What about Greenland? I want to ask you a question. I don't know if anyone's asked you this on air before, but do you think it would be different if it wasn't Pezeshkian or if it was Saeed Jalili who had won the last presidential race?
Yeah, I think it would be different. Yes, I do think it would be different. I think there is a different jibe, call it that, in Iran. And, no one is looking to the West anymore. A few years ago, the Bazaris, the merchant class, were still looking towards, the idea of turning West, but no more. They see the economic future is in Central Asia. They see it with Russia and China. It's changed. That is a dramatic shift that is taking internally in Iran. I mean, we still have it, but, no one now, after the deceit of the June the 12th, where, they were planning to talk with Witkoff and Kushner on the following Monday. Yeah. And then, wham, on the Friday night, they were attacked. I don't think there is, I think, and, what happened in Venezuela and all these things have added to a sense. But I think also a very clear point is, Syria. I think Iranians have all seen what, a regime change actually means for ordinary people on the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, the unleashing of killings and score settlings and terrible tortures and burnings and so on. So, I don't think, if there had been a constituency in Iran that was never big, but a small one that sort of hoped to go back to that, I don't think it exists now.
Yeah. No, I would agree with you. Alastair, I'd love to get to some broader topics because the world is changing so much. This is just one incident, right? We're Venezuela, Iran, Greenland, Cuba, Mexico, Nigeria, honestly, Canada. It's not like he hasn't put that on the table. My view, as you know, is that the U.S. and its allies are in serious, likely existential decline. So they're forced to be kinetic, showing, chest beating, projecting a false sense of strength and hegemony. That's how many people read it. But let's look what might really be playing behind the scenes. I'm very proud to say in 2022, the Cradle published a piece called The West's Plan B, Securing the Realm. In it, our author, Fadi Lama, argues that Washington, understanding the inevitability of multipolarity, would seek to grab as many resource-rich and geostrategic nations in the next few years so as to create a more limited empire from which it could feast and continue to thrive. And isn't that what we're seeing right now? Isn't that what Venezuela, oil, Greenland, energy and natural rare earth minerals, Nigeria, oil, Canada, plenty of resources. Isn't that what we're seeing right now? A grab for oil, silver, rare earths, a mad attempt at the same time to prop up the dollar, which is fiat currency, not backed by anything of substance. So if you have the natural resources, you can, trade in the dollar, those resources. Because if the dollar collapses or is largely dropped as the globe's reserve currency, the US can no longer power project. Gone are the wars, gone are the military bases, all of this is gone. Is that what the US is doing right now, securing the realm, and Europe be damned? Let's put that on the table too.
I think there are two parts to this. I think one part is, if you like, a drawing in and securing the Western Hemisphere. And, people say, well, what about Greenland? I think everyone knows you can't extract minerals and mines from Greenland because they're under a kilometer of ice, and the cost of it would make it prohibitive. But I think he wants to be able to say, look, I'm the only president that's increased the American landmass by so many percent. No one, they've always lost land, and now I've brought land, even if, they can just play along the edges of Greenland.
America's huge now.
It's huge, it's bigger. But I think the other thing was, the other point of it was the resources are vital because of the economic crisis. There's been a huge increase in leverage and financialization in America over this last decade. And it's not backed by any real assets. It's leverage, it's credit that is just produced out of thin air. It's virtual. And, whether it's derivatives or options or anything, what if something goes wrong, what stands behind it? Is there someone, when the musical chairs stop, has someone actually got, money or gold or something real to back it up? And so I think this is partly it, the idea of wanting to get resources into the banking system, into the financial system. And even though it's false in the sense that Venezuela's oil reserves are not going to be translated into money, into sort of collateral. All of this is about getting collateral. And so, but the problem is there's a basic contradiction in all of this, is he desperately needs real money coming in to fund the AI mega companies, the Magnificent Seven. They are just consuming huge amounts of money to build these big data centers, and they don't produce revenue. It's not working. It's not producing. At most, it's something like 3%. But banks estimate they're going to need 5 trillion more. I was in China last month, and it was so striking how the Chinese see that the West has taken a completely wrong turn on AI, on these mega companies. And they've done something quite different. What they've done is they've taken what they would call as dilute AI and applied it to real manufacturing technological needs at a different level from the West. But they have changed it. And I was talking to a big manufacturer in China, and he said, look, as if you take, he has many companies. If you take one of them, say a year ago, if it employed 2,000 people, it now employs 200. Yes, jobs have lost, but we're growing so fast, mostly these will be taken up. But we are so competitive, we have price deflation. And I said, oh my God, you've got price deflation because you've become so competitive because of this diffused AI application. And the West has price inflation. Then we have the moment of clash coming because the West won't be able to sell anything to you. and you're self-sufficient except for a few items like aircraft, we are really at that moment. The Greeks used to describe it as that impasse that you have when one country is rising and one country. And it was quite clear to me, they have the leverage, America doesn't. One example, a gigawatt of power in America for these mega, aircraft carriers of electronic equipment in China is 1/6 of the price. The dollar would have to be devalued by about 145% to make America competitive on this basis. But what happens if he doesn't get the investment and doesn't complete the AI? Then it crashes, then the market crashes.
Well, it's worth pointing out that Michael Burry, who we know from shorting subprime mortgages, which did in fact happen, that collapsed, and the whole Ponzi scheme brought down, banks that are too large to fail, and the Western financial system, markets tanked, etc. He has predicted the bursting of the AI bubble, that this doesn't have legs. Sometimes things pushed from the top move way faster than compliance, adaptability, etc., let alone the competition. Russia, China, Iran, India, there are countries who are participating heavily in their own constructions of these things, at a fraction of the cost. And this is in resource-rich parts of the world, by and large, right? I don't know what they're thinking. I mean, everyone's talking about AI. It bores the hell out of me, Alastair. It's just a lot of talk at a certain level of society. I'm not seeing it yet, and I think they could well lose the race, but they're putting all their eggs in this basket, right? This pack silica, Qatar just joined, right? They brought Qatar in. Israel's on board. The UAE is supposed to sign up, which brings us to another issue, and I think we definitely have to talk about this before we end our interviews, because it's such a pertinent part of what's happening in West Asia today. Not enough people are discussing it because of what's happening in Iran. But my goodness, the confrontation between Saudi Arabia and the UAE is public. Okay, this is rather unprecedented. We know that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, asked Trump to halt the UAE-backed RSF, right? Militia, absolutely dreadful, murderous militia in Sudan, to stop their recent gains in Sudan. And then the UAE backed Southern Transitional Forces in Yemen made a major foray after that into Yemen's Hadramaut area, essentially capturing the south, having it in UAE backed hands, right? And then comes Israel's recognition of Somaliland. Coco, can we put up the map that shows this essential fight visually? Because sometimes we're big on maps of the cradle because a picture can, explain more than many words can. And so, Israel's recognition of Somaliland, where the UAE already has a military base, the die was cast. Nobody could any longer ignore that the Emiratis and Israelis were making a major regional play that goes beyond West Asia, well into, North Africa, the Horn of Africa. And it wasn't a simple thing. As you said early on, this is about geoeconomics. This is about roots and resources and things like that. And if you look at this map, actually, I don't know if we can get a bigger version of this, Coco, because the UAE is, an even bigger one, where we can see all of Saudi Arabia as well. Okay, hang on. I just want to make a point that was sort of like the penny dropped for me a few weeks ago when I saw a map and realized what this meant. But in essence, everybody's worried about the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has a lot of leverage because it can shut it down, and then what's everyone going to do, right? So, with the China's Belt and Road Initiative, everybody started thinking about routes, right? Not necessarily across continents, but at least in their region. Railways, roads, um, uh, ports, right? Now look at where Saudi Arabia obviously, traverses the Persian Gulf all the way to the other side. So land routes are much cheaper than shipping routes, and the Saudis can build something, across Saudi Arabia, right, from the Persian Gulf, across Saudi Arabia, by land, through Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, etc., to the Mediterranean Sea, which is why, Israel wants chaos to keep humming in those areas, and so does the UAE. All right. Now the UAE is stuck there at the bottom right, okay, of the Arabian Peninsula. It doesn't have, if the Saudis say no, it has no land, by which it can traverse to the Mediterranean, which is a big issue for them. So the UAE played very heavily in the last 10 years in Yemen, and it kind of snuck under the Saudi cloak and got busy in the south, right? Taking over a bunch of ports. And look where, obviously, I'm not explaining this for you, Alastair, but for our viewers, because I know you know this stuff, very, very well. The UAE is right across from Somaliland, right? This is an Israeli Emirati project. And what's interesting about this is where basically no Arab country stood up for Gaza because they were unable to face down a military power like Israel. Unable. They can't. On the world stage, militarily, diplomatically, they can't. They could do that with the UAE, right? And by cutting off the legs of the UAE, you take out Israel's counted on Arab proxy, right? And money bag, which can then defeat the Israeli Roots Project, even defeat Israel's goal to become the energy star of the Eastern Mediterranean. Anyways, I've spoken enough. What do you make of the Saudi UAE conflict coming, being played out so openly? There was the thought that, okay, the first sort of salvos were in the open, but now they'll manage things behind the scene. I think there's worse to come. What do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely so. And I think the other part of it that's so important is the role of Turkey. I mean, particularly we see Turkey involved in Syria against Israel. Israel is making very strong threats, saying it will not accept what's happening. Turkey has been suggesting the Russians play a role in Syria. And I think we are seeing a real shift taking place. Yes, we have on one side the UAE and Israel and America. But on the other side, I mean, Turkey is changing. Maybe as a result of upcoming elections, but it's is playing a much tougher role. And then there's Pakistan, who is becoming involved in this excess. So there's a big geopolitical, shift around that is taking place. This is going to be, the Pakistani, Turkish, Saudi alliance is going to be a very important factor in all of these things, including, with Yemen and with, but particularly the future of Syria, I believe, and therefore of Lebanon. And of course, Turkey said they want to be part of Gaza. They want to be involved in Gaza.
And they're holding strong.
And Israel doesn't like that. Yeah, they want that. And they're saying to Trump, if you want to work with Turkey, which is an important power, we want to be part of that. And the Israelis are going crazy about that. So yes, there's this whole sort of, you're absolutely right, a whole strategic realignment taking place. And it's difficult to foresee exactly where it's all going to end up. What will be the position of Qatar in all of this? Will it adhere already Bahrain, the Saudis are withdrawing from Bahrain. I mean, again, that's an enormous thing. I mean, a huge, particularly for your viewers, who will know that there's a huge Shi'i population in Bahrain that have been not happy with the government. And Saudis have now left it on its own. What are all these things going to happen?
The UAE is making inroads into Bahrain, which actually doesn't even make sense to me because Bahrainis are pretty much against Israel. You know what's we noted at the Cradle on one of our recent podcasts. It's quite interesting because for quite a while now, certainly through the Arab Spring, we've had, three axes in the region, right? The axis of resistance, and then you have the so-called moderate Arabs. Alastair, we have to think of a new name for this. It just doesn't sit right anymore. And then we what developed during the Arab Spring, which was the Turkey-Qatar axis, right? But this new configuration against the UAE has brought all three axes on the same side, which is kind of remarkable. And there's a lot that might happen beyond Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, because let's be honest, any kind of military alignment there could switch tomorrow when there's a new development in the region. I think these are temporary. They might take hold, but new configurations that are coming into being because they are also singularly against the Emiratis now. And it's almost like all the frustration in the region from 2 years of absolute impotence against Israel has been turned on this one very wealthy Arab emirate,
As a proxy for all the frustrations, yes. Yeah.
They can only beat up on low-hanging fruit. They can't take the big guys. I mean, sadly, we'll leave it to Iran to maybe do that. Any last thoughts on this? Are we going to see? Are we going to see the Saudis and Iranians get closer? I mean, where do you think the Saudis genuinely stand behind these war drums threatening war in Iran? I mean, do you think after June the Saudis didn't start to realize, oh my gosh, the entire region will be at Israel's mercy if we don't have this axis standing? The one axis that's beaten them back.
I think the Saudis woke up at one point, or MBS woke up and realized that he was being surrounded by UAE and Israel, therefore, and that he was in danger of being really surrounded, whether it's in the south or in Yemen, everywhere he was being surrounded. So I think he's then moved into this axis with Turkey. But I was going to say that I think one of the most important things which I think we will see accelerated in this period, which is going to change again these alliances, is that China has the ability to unroll and unfold this economic structures across. When I was in China last month, WeChat, which is a payment system like Alipay and so on, has more than 1 billion people. 1 billion.
And it does everything.
It does everything. Well, they've already scaled it. To scale it across, and they are introducing new things all the time. For example, no publicity in the West, nothing. The Bank of China has just told its banks that it has to pay interest on digital yuan kept in wallets by people. Well, that'll appeal to a lot of people that they can hold digital yuan in wallets and get an interest payment on it as well. It's in the black, and it's, not so easily sort of traceable. It's out of the dollar sphere. But, if you look at it as an investor or one of these Gulf people and you're chosen, either you have to go, you follow one of these cryptocurrencies that Trump has been promoting, but they are tied to the U.S. Treasury 10-year bond. And of course, the dollar is devaluing and the bonds are devaluing consequently. whereas the American banks even say the yuan is about 20% undervalued. So if you're given the choice between where you would do it, and China is also innovating things like gold warrants on the Shanghai Monetary Exchange. Instead of having a treasury, U.S. Treasury, you can own one of these warrants, and then you can change it in either Hong Kong, which is outside of the control area of China, or in other parts. It's coming to Dubai, I think, and to Saudi Arabia very shortly, where you can either put in gold or have gold, or you can have a warrant. And probably those warrants will soon pay interest. Who knows? But I mean, this thing is changing really rapidly. And after Trump's mistake, I believe it's a huge mistake of putting 25% tariff on any state, i.e. China, trading with Iran. I mean, this is back to the tariff wars, and China is going to squeeze back hard, I think, this time. You know, they gave him one go, and then he comes behind their back and puts a 25% tariff back on. Rare earths, tech won't be flowing towards the United States, I think, from China. And why I'm saying all this, because ultimately the time by which the West Asia could sort of try and keep one foot in one camp and another foot in another camp, you know, was Saudi Arabia a member of BRICS or wasn't it? No one ever knew. I mean, this sort of keeping, you know, one thing in one thing, I think is coming to an end. Because Trump is going to stop it. He makes it clear that, you know, anyone that does business with America has to do it only in dollars and only for American companies. And so I think soon they're going to have to choose. And I think it's pretty obvious that they are going to choose to look east and not to look west.
Yeah. And, you know, last year I think it's based in London. It's a Association of Global Central Banks. And they were saying that I think Chinese yuan holdings had increased across central banks, I think 14%. And I don't recall now if it was from the year before or in a few years. But also, you know, there was discussion about gold holdings being increased everywhere. And we did a reel at the Cradle on a new Chinese transaction system. And in the comments there were so many people saying, oh, we already have this in Latin America. We already have this in Africa. Or we already have this in Southeast Asia. Or we've been doing this for the longest, or at least a few years. The point is, I mean, if you want to talk about globalism dying, it's, you know, it's true. Maybe I wouldn't use the Thai baht, right? But in Southeast Asia, right, regionally, people understand the Thai baht and they will trade in it. And so this is what we're seeing, like overnight, because of these trading platforms done within regions where people understand the currency, right? We're seeing this happening everywhere, which means, again, I don't even know, given the proliferation of these transaction systems, Alastair, whether the reporting on the use of the US dollar in international transactions has not dropped much more than is reported. I mean, because you hear it everywhere and you see it. I mean, this year I went to Russia and China, both. My first time in China and my first time since I was a kid in Russia. And oh my goodness, you know, very calm, very chill. Nobody's panicked. Everything's chugging along. They have everything. You know. So I'm seeing like a slow moving multipolar world. This is how things get built, right? Slowly, incrementally, public acceptance, compliance, and then the next step. It's not what's happening in the West. It's, you know, executive order after executive order, new rulings. Nobody can fight them. It's just a lot of noise. And I'm just wondering if in this year even we're going to see the tipping point.
Oh, yes, I think it is. Tipping point happened actually in October. It was the first month in which, you know, there are two clearing systems. SWIFT is the rather ancient system for interbank clearing. in the West, and then there's chips, which is the Chinese. And in October, which was the first time that the daily balance of, I think it was about 1.7 trillion, was greater passing through the chips than it was through the SWIFT. And that's a very clear signal that things are moving much faster. And it's not in the Chinese interest to sort of make a show of it. They want to do it quietly, gently. That's their character. And so they do it very, very effectively. And none of the things that I've mentioned about, that they also have moved to an interbank clearing system. It used to be called MBRICS, and it involved Middle East countries run by the BIS. And then just before the BRICS summit at Kazan, the BIS said, absolutely not. We're going to withdraw from this completely because, we're against BRICS and you've got to maintain the dollar hegemony. And so the Chinese took it over. It was their data. It was really their tech anyway that did it for instantaneous bank-to-bank clearing. And so they took it and they just called it BRIC. And then a few months ago, Lavrov announced, oh, by the way, we're going to extend the BRIC technology to all the members of BRICS and indeed to the Belt and Road. Well, that's 90% of the world virtually. So, these things, it's quiet. It was not a big, splash. And I don't think in the West they even noticed it. But, that was an enormous thing. So interbank clearing is, I think there are 7 Middle East countries and about 140, no, maybe that's too much. But many, many other countries have signed up to the digital one already. And you can just clear it in seconds in this way, or you can stay in, if you like, in a crypto form as well in the digital one. And as I say, now they're you can change that into gold or not through the Shanghai Metal Exchange. And you can have warrants if you want to have it. And they're giving panda bond lending. So increasingly, people are borrowing in yuan. Even Hungary, Europeans, rest of Europe probably wouldn't touch it, but Hungary and other states are borrowing in yuan. It's cheaper and it's available. And I think those panda bonds are growing enormously. The capital markets in China are still much less than in the West, but they are still growing, I think, by 20 trillion altogether. So a big shift is already underway. And my point was, after China, I could see that actually it only needs a click of the switch. And that whole thing could extend right across because all the components to it are already there and they just have to be made more operational. And I think that's what they're going to do.
I think we could be coming full circle in this interview because imagine if the U.S. or Israel launches a war in Iran and takes hits that nobody expected. You can see the Arab Gulf countries very quickly say, oh, we're done with this. Let's start trading everything in yuan. Do you know? It would take a lot change after the June war in the Persian Gulf countries. There was, it was tangible. Different thinking was emerging. And a second defeat will not be good for the United States and its allies. Alastair Crooke, this has been an absolute pleasure. A great start to the Cradle's new interview series. I can't thank you enough. I would love to see you back with us soon. And, hopefully during a settled time where we can drill deeper into things happening in this region that, everyone just covers like the big stories. But there are such interesting things happening in the region, interesting transactions between new partners. And I think when you bring that to light, we help people see the 200-meter picture instead of, the weeds that we're constantly stuck in. So Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you. I'm privileged to be in your inaugural program, and I wish it all the best in the future editions of it. I'm sure it will be very successful. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alastair. And don't forget to press that like button, subscribe, and join us at Patreon, where you get to ask us questions every week for a Patreons only Q&A with expert Cradle staff. And starting this month, Patreons, you might like this, Alastair, too, will also receive original Cradle maps created just for them every week because, it helps you visually sum up what's happening in West Asia and why. As always, follow us on X, Telegram, Instagram, TikTok, Rumble, and Spotify, and see you next time at Rock the Cradle. West Asia is always on the map, but rarely in its own voice. This region has been narrated by others for far too long. That's why the Cradle exists, to report from the region, not to speak over it.
Together, the United States
to tell stories with depth, precision, and no editorial leash. Because West Asia is more than just a theater of war. It's the corridor between continents, the energy artery of the world, the cradle of civilization. We don't take government orders. We don't serve corporate boards. We serve clarity, rarity, and rawness, no matter the risk. So if you believe this region deserves better than spin, support the people doing the legwork. Donate. Keep the Cradle independent.